Angelina Jolie, Madonna, David Bowie, Meryl Streep, Jane Fonda, Judy Garland, O.J. Simpson, who might be the biggest diva on this list. Um, Welcome to Orbitals, an astrology podcast. I'm your host, William Holloway, and today's show is all about the 12th house. With me to discuss and dissect is my special guest astrologer, Hannah Kuhary. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get into the 12th house. So, I wanted to do an episode on the 12th house because I think it's one of the more misunderstood of the houses. Has a variety of interpretations. So it can be a little confusing, especially for newer astrology students. But some of the things of the 12th house that are pretty commonly understood, it's known as the house of self-undoing, the house of the bad spirit, the house of secret enemies, suffering, misfortunes, imprisonment, isolation. More modern takes on the 12th house include the occult, the psychic realm, even past lives and karma. So that's a lot of different stuff right there.
All happy stuff.
All happy stuff, right? Very happy.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I agree. I think the 12th house can be a really challenging topic to kind of wrap your head around, but I think it's also one of the most fascinating areas of the chart to dive into. And I love the descriptions that you gave to as starting points for the 12th house. I would also like to add that Manilius talked about it as being the portal of toil, which I think is a great kind of visual for the 12th house because so much of what you brought up really speaks to the liminal nature of the 12th house. Yeah, weakness and sickness and infirmary and kind of ill omen when we think about the 12th. But of course, all of that seems so like dark and heavy. And certainly there's a lot of really challenging connotations. And I think for modern astrologers and kind of just like the day-to-day human that's just trying to make it through 2025, it's like, oh, that sounds really negative. I don't want to make things be negative. However, I think just kind of accepting the challenging nature of this part of the chart is absolutely necessary and we shouldn't be shying away from that. And so I just want to also kind of just emphasize what you had already shared at the beginning, that just because there is obvious challenges with the 12th house, it is also such an enriching place, I think, when you start to unpack it, whether it's looking at your own chart or transits, or client examples, certainly too.
Yeah. When you first start listing off those significations, it does sound awful. And it doesn't mean that it's not it can't be difficult, but it's not all, mental illness and suffering and isolation and all that. Especially when you think about any planet that's going through the 12th is then going to go through the first. So, like, what does
Hmm.
that mean, right? What happens before that? So, I think a lot of the time with the 12th, it can be something that is maybe not made aware yet to the native,
Hmm.
right? I think,
Yeah,
yeah.
something that hasn't reached its expression, its open expression, seems to be denied in some form, or whatever the matter is, whether again it's there's a transit happening in the 12th house, it feels like it hasn't reached its form of maturity yet. So it's still in its kind of conceptual phase. And just kind of coming back to what does the 12th house look like? I'm a very visual person, and so I like to think visually about what does the 12th house look like in a day-to-day experience? And, when we think about the diurnal movement of the sun over the ascendant, it's then moving into the 12th house. So that is an area of the sky where planets, if they are close to the sun, are going to be combust. You're not going to be able to see it because the sun's light is drowning them out essentially. And I think that gives a lot of context to what you're saying, William. They haven't been expressed yet. They haven't reached a sense of clarity, or they haven't been externalized in a way that feels accessible. And the 12th house has also been connected to the birth canal and like the
Mm,
process of birth. And I'm a mother of two, so I feel like I really can understand that experience of that liminal being in between worlds. And planets there are, you know, they're in between this place of expressing themselves in their fullest and also coming into to view. And so there's that feeling of confinement. I think it was Pretorius, which made the assimilation of the 12th house being akin to the mother's laboring process, where,
mhm.
life force energy is tentative. I mean, I hate to say it. We're lucky being at this stage where modern medicine brings most babies into the world in a healthy way. But back during medieval times or ancient times, labor was a really dicey process. The mother had a really good chance of passing away, and so did the baby. And so that liminality of being in between worlds, of not quite yet of flesh, but still not of only spirit, I think really helps us to kind of understand how planets are functioning in this 12th house space.
That actually brings me to, I wanted to read something from Demetra George's Ancient Astrology, Volume 2. I really like
Yes.
her, yeah, her takes on the houses.
What I like about Demetra's exploration of the 12th house in this chapter is that she, first starts with the ancient and the medieval and the Arabic understanding of the 12th house, but also kind of brings in, when we think about the 12th house as being this kind of liminal in between space with birth, and as you're talking about planets there kind of having their impression upon a soul before they're born, also kind of likens to the more modern understanding of the 12th house and reference the 12th house as being a more unconscious place, a
Hmm.
place where there is, impressions happening in our subconscious or have been kind of influenced upon us as we were still in our mother's womb.
Yeah, and it kind of gives a bridge to the more modern idea of it being the psychic realm. You can start to understand how that can look. But yeah, here's let me I'll read this. In the late 19th century, Sigmund Freud popularized the idea of the unconscious as the hidden realm of the psyche that contains all the disturbing, socially unacceptable contents that we fear and actively repress. As astrology became increasingly psychologized, during the 20th century, the 12th house became the repository of this hidden realm of the psyche, the container of the denied, hated, ostracized parts of the self. She goes on to talk about the secret self and how this, this ties into being the place of self-undoing. So yeah, so modern versus ancient takes on the 12th house. One thing that I don't agree with about the modern take, and it's not all modern astrologers, but there is, and you see it in like books from like the 80s a lot of the time,
Mhm.
associating a sign with
Oh,
a
yeah,
house, right? And so that you'll find people talk about the 12th house as being the house of Pisces,
right. And ruled by Neptune. That's
right?
a no.
And that's a big no. That's the one that really
Yeah,
doesn't work. It never, you can only go so far
no,
with that.
yeah, that doesn't work for me.
Yeah, it doesn't work for me either. And the idea of the House of Secret Enemies. What do you think about that interpretation of secret enemies and maybe how that might look more now than it did back then?
Yeah, I think the Arabic and medieval texts actually emphasize more so than the ancient Greeks, the 12th house being a place of hidden nature and hidden jealousy. And
Mm,
so when we think about the 12th house being this place that gives us or kind of plots these experiences that have this hidden nature, this hidden jealousy, or these ulterior motives, perhaps. We can understand that as people that come into our lives that bring misfortune. Maybe it's a rough breakup. Maybe it's being cheated on by an ex. Maybe it's someone that led us astray, that made a promise and ended up stabbing us in the back. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a business partner. So I think this idea around jealousy, people saying one thing, doing another, to our misfortune can definitely be applied to modern life. I mean, I'm sure people listening right now are thinking of experiences like that. Secrets, scandals, family. skeletons in the closet. Like those are all 12th house experiences. And again, I think, we all can have some kind of connection to.
And then when it comes to this is one I think is interesting though. The idea of the occult. Because you see that with the eighth house being discussed as the
Hmm.
house of the occult, but also sometimes the ninth house. Maybe ninth house is a little bit more like
Hmm.
pagan, a little bit more like ritualistic, a little bit more,
Religious.
maybe more religious.
Yeah.
Right. More like,
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, I think of the 12th house. I mean, a lot of the ancient texts specifically say witchcraft being
Hmm.
associated with the 12th house, whereas the eighth house is kind of more encompassing of the occult. And when we think about, well, why would they have associated the 12th house with witchcraft? It's definitely a reflection of the times, right? That people were distrusting of people that they thought were casting spells behind their back and were out to
Mm-hmm.
kill them, especially if they were people of notoriety, if they were a king or a queen or a prince or someone that had a lot of land or perhaps owned a lot of slaves. They were someone of social status or had a lot of wealth. And so people were not very trusting, of course, when they're like in that position, just like now too. But this thought that people were casting spells to try to take them down from their place of prominence, I think, is what alludes a lot to witchcraft. And of course, things being hidden and, in that kind of place where it's happening behind the scenes where you're not seeing it in front of your eyes. So yeah, to me, that's kind of what I gather in terms of the kind of witchy aspect or the witchcraft aspect to the 12th house.
Going back a little bit to the idea of Pisces and Neptune definitely not ruling over the 12th house.
Hmm.
But then some of those significations that people identify with, like the psychic realm, can be associated with the 12th house.
Hmm.
It's not like, again, it's like the ninth house is religion. So is it like, are we thinking more like spiritual experiences or like awakenings are more 12th house? What would you say, like the difference between like,
That's a great question. I guess when I spend some time thinking about it, to me, the ninth house and even the third house are more encompassing of themes around deities, rituals, religion, spirituality, in more of a kind of philosophical, theological way, right? That gives
Mhm.
some kind of structure to how we view the world, how we experience the world, either day to day, the rituals that we partake in that give us a sense of connection to the divine or a larger sense of the universe. Whereas the 12th house, those are those experiences that we can't necessarily consciously maybe put our finger on when it happens, but we are experiencing them in some way. And so they don't maybe rationally or objectively make sense. And when I think of the 12th house and those kind of psychic experiences, I think, okay, well, these are maybe individuals that have natal planets there. And I know we're going to talk about that in a second, so I won't dive too much into this. But I think it's also important to think about it, the 12th house as being a place where as planets are transiting through there, they're kind of going through this liminal portal or this liminal passage, right? Where they're in between worlds. They're not functioning either up in this diurnal space where they're being really seen and visible or in this lower subterranean world either. So it's a place that is very unfamiliar, I think, for a lot of the planets. And yeah, they're being kind of diluted. Stars in the sky nearing that part of the horizon would be difficult to see at night. And so in the same way we can imagine that planets moving through that or transiting through that area of the chart are also kind of having this very in-between worldly experience. And if you want to consider that a psychic experience, a dream experience, dreams are oftentimes connected or having premonitions being connected to 12th house experiences. Even kind of coming back to the experience of birth, when a baby is in the birth canal, yeah, it's still in its mother's body, it's physical, but it's in between that space of still being in its gestational container and not yet into the world breathing on its own with its own lungs and its own autonomous body. It's still connected to something that it needs for its life. So
Mhm.
yeah, I kind of think that back about planets being this gestational place too, where they perhaps have a more subjective connection to that greater um, divine realm than perhaps they would if they were in a different part of the chart.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's a great way of putting it. Kind of made me think about like seeing an apparition or something when you it's like kind of there, but you're like,
Mm-hmm.
am I seeing this? Is there something there, or is my mind deceiving me? Is this like a
Right.
moment where like worlds are colliding, or like the veil is thin, or am I having a psychosis moment? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great visualization. And I've heard that connection with the 12th house as being a place of like ghosts or apparitions, whether that's in a literal sense or in a more descriptive, subjective sense. I think it both works there. It's
Yeah,
like you can't quite put your finger on what that experience was, but it was very visceral. You felt it. It was believable in some way, but being able to use your rational intelligence and logic to explain with fact what had occurred or what you felt may not be possible.
exactly. Totally. All right, let's look at some examples. So the sun in the 12th. There's a lot of celebrities with their sun in the
Hmm.
12th. And a lot of
There
astrologers know
is,
that
yep.
it's a thing. I've heard an astrologer or two call the 12th house sun placement the diva placement. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Hmm. I
It can,
haven't heard it called that, but I can see it.
anyone listening can decipher whether they think this grant's being called the diva placement. So we have Kylie Minogue, Jodie Foster,
Mhm.
Angelina Jolie, Tori Amos, Madonna, David Bowie, Shaquille O'Neal, Janis Joplin, Meryl Streep, Jane Fonda, Judy Garland, O.J. Simpson, who might be the biggest diva on this list, um, and then Taylor Swift, which I know people might say like, well, there's no time confirmed, but most people either fall into two camps. They either think she's a Scorpio rising or a Capricorn rising, and I think to me it's pretty
Mhm.
clear she's a Capricorn rising, and that would put her Sagittarius sun in the 12th.
I would
But
agree.
and I mean, look at her. That is a Capricorn rising if you've ever seen one.
100%. Those
She,
cheekbones for sure.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Totally.
I would also add to that list, Steve Carell is also a 12th house sun.
Yes. Yes, that's right. I knew that. Very good. Speaking of Taylor Swift, was that there was a video I remember seeing sometime last year where like she was being carted in a janitor cart like to this to her stage. Like
Oh,
she couldn't
yes.
walk basically, right?
Hmm.
From wherever
Right.
like so she's literally being carted in the janitor cart. And to me that just feels very 12th house sun because
Hmm.
it's like you're being shielded from the public because it's not safe for you to be in the public. These are all very recognizable people that most of them can't just walk around. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yep.
Like they can't just go to McDonald's, basically. Whereas then
Right.
it's funny, I wrote that down and then I saw a video of Lady Gaga recently in a McDonald's, and I was like, well, she's definitely not a 12th house son because she will go to McDonald's.
Yes. Yeah, and I think a great a great example you gave some great examples of people with 12th house sons. And I would say for most of those individuals, while they are fantastically famous, all of those people have a deep a deeply private personal life that they keep to themselves. I think Angelina Jolie is a great example. She's incredibly protective of her children. Um, all of them have this kind of mysterious aura or allure to them.
Hmm.
David Bowie, of course, a great example of a 12th house person. And I think a lot of people that have their son in the 12th house are incredibly observant. They
Mm.
really are fantastic at reading a room, feeling the vibes. They know their audience, and so they can offer themselves or a part of themselves in order to kind of shapeshift into that particular audience while still keeping the more vulnerable pieces or private parts of themselves to themselves. So yeah, and the interesting thing about people that have 12th house sons is of course their sun may be less noticeable than, say, their ascendant qualities. People probably are going to identify with their ascendant qualities because that's, when we think about the relationship between the 12th house and the first house, it being a cadent house, it's a dark place. It doesn't receive light from the ascendant. And so it is in that sense hidden or obscure. And it's hard for planets in the 12th house then to have a relationship with the ascendant or the first house. So I think a lot of people, when they realize that a lot of these famous individuals have their sun in the 12th house, and then they think about, oh, what's their ascendant? They perhaps identify them more with their ascendant first than their sun sign or the qualities of their sun.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like Madonna being a Leo, I mean, she's totally a Leo, but I mean, that is a Virgo rising. Like when you think about like her
She looks
career.
like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. She had, I mean, for so much of her career, really leaned into those like androgynous
Hmm.
Virgo qualities, very mercurial. Yeah,
Very.
absolutely.
And I know she
Hmm.
was going around t for a while. They're saying she was an Aquarius rising. I'm like, no, you're not. You are not an Aquarius.
No, no
You just
way.
think that sounds cool. She's just someone told her
That's
that
not
that
who
was
you are.
cool. Yeah. There's no way
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not going to go through every planet, but I thought at least the sun, moon, and maybe some others.
Hmm.
But some of the moon people I found were Julian Assange, Abe
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln, Liberace, Nina Simone, and Eileen Wuornos, who was the
Mm-hmm.
famous female serial killer.
Hmm.
The one thing that I could tie all of these people together is that they've all, at some point or another, had a secret, or they were hiding
Yes.
something about themselves. You know,
Hmm.
Julia Assange literally having to be in hiding. Um,
Yep.
Abe Lincoln, more every year I hear more and more how like it's pretty clear that he was uh, a homosexual and he was hiding that
Hmm.
side of him. Liberace, obviously. Um,
Obviously.
yeah, yeah. Nina Simone, I mean, she had there was a lot of stuff. I mean, she had some mental illness. She had some abuse that
Hmm.
apparently she was abusive in a lot of her there was a lot of stuff behind the scenes with her that was yeah, so you could probably just pick something. And then Eileen Wuornos, obviously, she was hiding the fact for a period of time that she was a serial killer or attempting to hide that.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, I also have like 12th house moon people in my life. And when I was looking at all their charts and then these celebrities or these known people, that came to me was I thought about that maybe the thing that these people struggle with is a distrust of their own animal body.
Mm.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
just one
I could
take.
see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. What do you
I
think about
think, yeah, I think that's an interesting consideration. My immediate impression of people with their moon in the 12th house, and I also have people in my life that have their moon here, is this feeling of invisibility and feeling incredibly misunderstood in their
it?
life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really common 12th house experience, kind of all encompassing if you have natal planets there, but in particular, the moon being such a reflection of our very changeable nature, our connection to our body, of course, the emotional tides. I think people that have their moon in such a liminal place really struggle to feel like they're not fully recognize or that their intention or their love or their comforts are not reflected back to them. And maybe that can be, seen in their childhood as like being really quiet, being the quiet kid, being shy, being more detached, just being more observant, the
Mm-hmm.
one who senses more than they're necessarily expressing. Maybe as adults, they're people that feel like they're playing a role for others when they keep that deeper part of themselves more hidden or inaccessible. So I do think that there is this feeling of misunderstanding with people that have their moon there that they spend a good portion of their life really working on kind of reclaiming that light that they feel like that's not being reflected back to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great way of putting it. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people that have their moon there tend to be incredibly intuitive, very
Hmm.
visionary, very connected to their imaginal self. Maybe they were highly creative individuals when they were children, and even now in life. I mean, we see a lot of people with very creative drive that have their moon in the 12th house, which I think is beautiful, being really connected or attuned, kind of having like their antenna in the right place to receive information or visions through writing or art or music or
Yeah.
dreams. I mean, I think you can also make the same argument for the sun there, but I think with lunar people, there's less confidence. I think it's more just feeling very attuned to something that other people aren't seeing or recognizing. And you were making a point about the 12th house, and also the eighth house is feeling like um, kind of a sense of like awareness of like what are other people going to think of me. And I think the sixth house too, just in opposition of the 12th house, is a lot of that feeling too of like worried about being taken advantage of, worried that people aren't identifying your intentions and they're only reacting to how they perceive you through their own filter. And again, I think that's because these houses are not receiving light from the ascendant. It's not clear, it's very nebulous. And the 12th house is also connected to bondage and captivity and slavery. And so we can even think about, you know, having your moon in the 12th house, feeling very enslaved by sometimes your own internal narrative or feeling completely captive by your own emotional experience or, those feelings that tell you this is how it is, when in reality, everyone's like, don't worry about it. It wasn't a big deal. And you're
Right.
like, I mispronounced your name, whatever it is.
Right.
So yeah, that feeling of being captive or being in bondage or enslaved by something internal, I think
Yeah.
is also really referencing planets there, personal planets in the 12th house.
Absolutely. We don't need to go through every planet, but I did want to briefly talk about Saturn in the 12th because Saturn is, said to be in its joy in the 12th house.
Hmm.
These are some Saturn in the 12th people I found. Whitney Houston, Michael J.
Hmm.
Fox, Carrie
Hmm.
Fisher, Oprah Winfrey, Barack Obama, George Washington, and Donald Trump.
Yeah, good examples.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it seems almost like, okay, so some of the things you could gather from this is that some of these people struggle with boundaries or had struggled with boundaries. Or maybe they've mastered the art of boundaries. I don't know. There seems to be what do you think like to have someone like, Whitney Houston or Carrie Fisher who both struggled with addiction most of their lives.
Hmm.
But then Barack Obama, George Washington, Donald Trump, these like known world leaders, whatever you think
Hmm.
of them. But like, what do you think that means for them to have Saturn in the 12th?
I think it's a feeling of like one has to fulfill a very concrete set of duties or responsibilities, and that can show up in one's relationships, that could show up in one's, of course, if we're talking about presidents, a lot of the challenging aspects of being commander in chief of what that's going to look and feel like. I mean, if we think about people of prominence, the 12th house is a place where this is hidden enemies or people
Yeah.
that have ulterior motives. And whether that's an individual or another country, you're having to deal with trying to figure out what that is. There's not a lot of transparency there. Yeah, I think, Saturn in the 12th, that being its place of joy, there's a lot there that again is really emphasizing hidden matters that cause disruption of some sort. And this is again where I think modern interpretation kind of comes in and says, well, is this karma? Is
Mm.
this passed over from previous lifetimes? Is this baggage that we're having to deal with via a soul contract? I don't know. I don't know if I necessarily bite off on that if I'm looking at it simply through the lens of a classical or traditional astrology, which is what I practice. But I think it's an interesting consideration when you think there's such a swing between some of these individuals and how we perceive them day to day. But I think the connection here between a lot of these examples that you gave is that there is some kind of major obstacle that these individuals have had to work through in their life. How that turns out doesn't necessarily mean success, but it is shaping the character of who they are. And
Yeah.
yeah, I say that with complete neutrality.
Yeah.
So um, I think it's a challenging placement, to have natally, to have Saturn there, because it can often feel like gosh, the world is always against me. I think about what's going on with Donald Trump and you know, a lot of the headlines from his camp is that there's a witch hunt against him,
Yeah.
right? That people are, out to make him the bad guy, which no comment there.
Oh, we can say he's the
However,
bad guy.
I he is a bad guy. So,
Like,
so the example, he using him as an example, again, it's how are we framing the situation? Um, Whitney Houston had a lot of trauma in her life, and yes, definitely struggled with relational boundaries with, of course, drugs and alcohol, and she was incredibly talented and gifted and successful. You know, the 12th house also being a place where modern astrology views it as escapism, right? Mental health challenges. And so, yeah, what do we do when the world feels like it's too much for us? What do we do when we feel like suffering is more than we can bear? What do we do when we have trauma that in our brains we don't want to deal with? We just don't feel capable of processing those experiences. Well, people become addicted to drugs to escape, or alcohol, or sex, or shopping, or whatever it is. And I think that really alludes to Saturn being finding its joy in the 12th house, this place of misfortune and sickness, but also as a place of decline, right? When we think about the 12th house as a place where planets have moved from diurnal movement, from a position of strength, being in the first house, being in a cardinal house, to then in a position of weakness, it's harder then to say no. It's harder then to initiate boundaries. Again, kind of coming back to Donald Trump, there's all this information that talks about, well, is he a Russian asset? Has he made deals with the devil? Has he made deals behind the scenes in order to save his back? Is it harder to say no if it means I'm getting what I want? I mean, same
mm,
with, again, Whitney Houston in a completely different example. So, I think that's an interesting consideration with Saturn here, is that it's not Saturn's doing, but Saturn is showing the challenge or the obstacle, and we're trying to kind of see through the dark here to get through it, and feeling a sense of, like I said, it could be responsibility, duty, obligation to see things through, but not having a light in some way to guide us. So
yeah.
yeah, that's difficult. I think the 12th house is, it is the most, in my opinion, the most hostile
Hmm.
place in the chart. When I was thinking about, preparing for our chat today, something that came to me was that, Aries ruling my 12th house, of course, that being Mars, is I have really struggled with anger. That was not something that I grew up witnessing. I did not grow up witnessing healthy conflict. Um, I have a really hard time with people being angry at me and allowing people to express anger in a healthy way. And so those very Martian themes are really packed down, like, in my subconscious. Those are things that I am constantly processing, and that I feel a lot of fear at times around, in terms of, how does this reflect upon me? How does
Yeah.
other people's fear, or if someone's mad at me, what does that say about me? So I just invite people listening is to think about the planet that rules their 12th house, and how does that connect to hesitation or fear or withdrawal for you? Are there relational themes that are maybe not inherently conscious, but if you spend some time kind of unpacking and thinking about it, if like Taurus or Libra rules your 12th house, like, does that make more sense to you? Because I don't have any planets in my 12th house,
Same.
but Mars transits for me are really challenging. Of course, I'm also a Scorpio sun, so Mars is my, rules my sun. But
And I'm a Scorpio moon. That's right.
oh,
Maybe
love it.
we may have deciphered this before. Yeah.
It took me a while to really identify what the 12th house looked and felt like for me, until I zeroed in on the planetary ruler. And then it was like, oh, I can't unsee this now. I recognize where my defensiveness comes in, where these behaviors that step in when I'm feeling really unclear or uncertain or threatened in some way, or fearful of something. Because yeah, the 12th house isn't going to be a place that is obvious in terms of its experiences. Sometimes it's going to take a little bit of effort, I think, to unravel those experiences and how they've shown up. And that's the mystery of the 12th house, is it can also be many things. But there is something there, I think, around where we perhaps are acting in our own, against our own self-interest.
Right.
And the planet that rules the 12th house can tell us a lot about those behaviors and actions.
Absolutely. So, Hannah, why don't you give yourself more of a proper intro and talk about your practice and some of the things you've got going on.
Thank you. Gosh, I like this is the always the part where I'm like, what do I say? So I've been a practicing professional astrologer for about 5, almost 6 years now, but I have loved astrology since I first discovered it when I was a tween on the back of magazines. And since then have just dove into the study of it all. With my practice, I really focus on traditional classical techniques. I read whole sign for the most part, but when I started my practice, I used angular systems. But yeah, I've switched over. I've been reading whole sign now for 5 or 6 years since I've really been doing professional work. But a big focus of my work at the moment is helping people kind of unpack the layers of their chart in a way that feels really relevant to modern times. And I realize it's kind of a vague statement, but this last year, I think with everything that's changed here in the United States, I felt just really compelled to help people reimagine their chart and the planets in their chart and their unique footprint in their natal chart that can give them a sense of hope in really tangible, concrete ways. And so some of the posts that I've shared recently is like, astrology for like the modern revolution, so to speak, and kind of rethinking planets in a really constructive and creative way. I'm also hosting a seventh house workshop, which has been another focus of my research more recently. I am a seventh house sun, and so one-on-one relationships are definitely my playground and my classroom. And it is also like the 12th house, an area of the chart that I think people really deeply misunderstand. And it is a really important part of the chart that helps us to understand how other people perceive us and also how our private life and our public life are inherently connected. And so I've got more information about that on my website, which is divineskymystic.com. Or I have lots of information on my Instagram as well, which is under the same handle, Divine Sky Mystic. But yeah, I offer natal chart readings, transit and progressions, which a lot of people have been jumping in on just to see what the year ahead unfolds for them with all of this major astrology of 2025. And I also love to do synastry and family constellation readings. So looking at our
Ooh.
natal chart in reference to other people in our life that we have connections, whether those connections are challenging or they're deeply fulfilling. I love doing readings for parents and their children or multi-generational and really seeing like what is the pattern that's being
Mm.
passed down cosmically through the chart. That's incredibly fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of relational astrology is really kind of core as well of my practice.
I love that. That's so great. Speaking to family, what are really quick, what are some things you do? Because I've seen in interfamily often like someone's moon sign will be their mother's sun sign, or they'll have the same moon sign as their mother, or they'll share something there, or they'll be the rising sign. There's always like something in the top, the big, three that they'll share in common. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, I do. To be honest, the patterns that I see are so varied. So I'll give
Mm.
a couple examples of my family, for instance, and that is, I come from a family that has a lot of like women, sisters, multi-generations. So I have two girls. I am the oldest sister of two girls. My mom is the oldest sister of two girls. Her mother is the oldest sister of two girls, and so on. This is like 6 generations
Oh, wow.
of oldest women. And the major pattern that I see in the women in my family is the moon in aspect to the nodal axis. So for me, I have my moon square my nodes. My sister also has her moon exact square her nodes. My mom has her moon conjunct the south node. Her mom had her moon square the nodes. My oldest daughter has her moon square the nodes. So that's like a major one that like you can't
Yeah.
unsee. And on my husband's family, my husband has Mars-Uranus conjunction, and his dad had a Mars-Uranus Sun conjunction. So, that's a pretty rare one to have,
Yeah.
in lineage. So it can be all planetary aspects. It could be Saturn Sun aspects. It's not always just about the sign. I find that a lot of the patterns are actually more planetary aspects, and it's not always just say like a planet in opposition. Sometimes it's square, but there seems to be a significant thread of similarity when you really start to look at the patterns between parents and their kids and their, as far back as you can get your hands on with the chart. Obviously, for a lot of the older generations, they don't have birth times, but you can
Right.
still see the planetary aspects, and that will still be really significant. So,
Yeah.
incredibly fascinating.
That's really cool.
Now
Awesome.
you're gonna have to go on a deep dive with your
Yeah,
family charts.
I know. I was thinking right now because I'm like, well, I don't know my grandmother's birth time, but I know her moon sign. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. All right. Well, are we ready to play the game of fate?
Yes,
All
please.
right. So how this works is I'm going to spin the wheel. It's going to give us a random planet, and then I'll spin the wheel, give us a random sign, and we will just go off of that. Let's
Let's do
spin
it.
the wheel.
Poor Judy. She looks like she's gonna have a headache. Let's see.
Right? Interesting. Neptune.
Okay.
Okay. So Neptune in. Oh, oh, Taurus. Neptune
Taurus,
in
just
Taurus.
barely.
Just barely. When was Neptune in Taurus? That would have been in the
So late 1800s, like the 1880s,
Oh,
1870s.
yes. Okay. Well then, you know what the first thing that comes to mind is the Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
The Gilded Age was totally born during Neptune and Taurus. So if anyone's seen that TV show called The Gilded Age, or there's a really good, I actually really recommend if people are into PBS, there's a really good documentary just called The Gilded Age, and
Mm-hmm.
it's actually streaming on YouTube, but it's very interesting.
Oh.
The country was get people were getting rich during this time. Like you had the gold rush was happening. People were,
Mm-hmm.
going out to California. The idea of creating like showing off your wealth, you know, like
Yes.
in
Very
this country,
materialistic.
very materialistic.
I think about Neptune and Taurus in that materialistic sense of, in terms of fashion, we saw a lot of like women wearing furs. So
Mhm.
like foxes, like, literal like foxes around their neck, hats that had like cranes and literal like bird heads on it. In fact, and I'm
Yes.
a crazy bird lady, being a Taurus rising.
I
So
love it.
there were a lot of birds and other animals that actually were on the verge of extinction during this time because they were so heavily hunted for fashion. The one that comes to mind is the whooping crane. That is now, I think we're down to about 800, and their numbers are starting to come back. But they were heavily hunted during the late 1800s because there was such a high demand in fashion to have their feathers and literally the bird head on ladies' hats. And same with different kinds of ermine and weasels for their fur. So yeah, that's what comes to mind is kind of the fantastical aspect of like the beauty of nature, but really over glamorized and over consumed in a very fantastical way as well as a being a resource. And
Yeah.
this time also birthed a lot of incredible artists. Pablo Picasso was born with Neptune in Taurus. Georgia O'Keeffe are the two that come to mind. There's quite a few American presidents that were born during this time. Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, and actually both Roosevelts were born during this time. Herbert
Okay.
Hoover. There was another, Coco Chanel. She
Oh,
also was born during this time.
Perfect.
So yeah, quite an interesting examples of like material wealth and materialism that I think that you were really speaking to with like the Gilded Age.
I mean, they were trying to create like what is wealth in America, right? Like this was the first
Hmm.
time we had a wealth class. And so they were
Yeah.
creating it from scratch. And so seeing these images, you'd think that they were like coming from another planet, almost like this is our idea of what a rich person looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, pulling it out of thin air and yet like building it out of these like literal scraps of animals.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something quite
And insects too. I want to say there was a lot of like insect jewelry, like you'd have like a big insect
yes.
in
Like
like a,
brooch.
yes.
Yeah, or like rings and jewelry and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, and very different from like when we think of like the Roaring Twenties in terms of the expression of wealth.
Hmm.
It in some ways, the Neptune in Taurus, it feels more crude. And I don't mean that in necessarily like a negative way, but it's like more crude materials.
Yes, totally. That's Neptune's next stop in 14 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of industrial revolution and moving ahead with technology during the late 1800s, I
Hmm.
think people were really excited by the possibility of what they could bring forward in a tangible way. And I think there was also this complete romanticism around being one with the earth. I would wonder if I feel like Walt Whitman did a lot of writing around the time Neptune was in Taurus. I'd have to look that one up. That one comes to mind. But it's kind of like this romanticized idea of like living with the earth and like being one with the earth, but also like wearing a bird on your head and wearing like a fox
Yeah,
around your neck. You
right.
know, like it's so ridiculous. But I think this speaks a lot to what is real in terms of our use of resources. And when I think ahead about what lies on the other side of Neptune and Aries for us, I just feel like climate crisis here is like this
Mm,
is just going to be an absolute moment of point of no return of people are like you are either in complete blinders around our use or misuse of resources, um, or it's putting the rosy colored glasses on and pretending that these problems don't exist, in a complete way of a spectacle. So yeah, I think that's my concern. If
yeah,
we look at the way things are going, I think it's just undeniable that climate crisis isn't going to be wrapped up in that. And I think Uranus in Taurus has really started to kind of shake things loose in that respect around what's ahead. So
yeah,
we'll see.
yeah. I mean, Neptune just went into Aries. So we've got 14 years to hash out all of this, and it's going to be an interesting ride.
I think Neptune and Pisces really showcased, you know, are questioning around reality and what reality do we want to partake in. And I think of the influencer culture as and really social media being so much encompassed in that Piscean
Yes.
facade around what are you projecting the image of people believing that's reality when in truth what's going on behind the scenes is completely different. And I think we're going to start to see a shift away from that influencer culture and moving much more into this kind of rebellious, more autonomous energy that Aries brings, which I think is going to be incredibly challenging on one hand, but also I don't mean that I don't want this to come out in the wrong way, but there is a lot of I think about Neptune and Aries as being a lot of rejection around allowing ourselves to over identify with victimhood and seeing
Mm,
where we need to just be, you know, rising up because of our own will and conviction instead of whatever it is that you feel like has limited you in some way in your life. I feel like there could be a real opportunity for the collective to kind of reclaim their power, and to
yes.
remember our individual power, that our individual voice, our individual vote really does matter, instead of just being like the Piscean response is like, well, what does everything matter anyway if it's not
Yes.
real? And Aries is like, it is fucking real because we're gonna make it real. I'm
Yes.
gonna light it up. So that to me feels exciting. But of course,
Yes.
we know that there's risks and it's gonna be challenging. But it feels more ignited than a lot of this kind of nebulousness that the last 14 years of this Piscean influence has brought us.
100%. I think that a lot of
Hmm.
that Neptune and Pisces was a lot of talk, online
Hmm.
activism, you know,
Virtue signaling.
virtue signaling. Yes.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I think of Aries as having that grit to it. And that's maybe what I think of like, that kind of like punk rock aspect to the Aries energy is that grittiness of kind of fuck around and find out.
Yep.
Now we're gonna like get in with it and make things happen. And so yeah, there's catalytic energy with Aries, whether or not we're ready for it. I think we just have to jump in and see what happens.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that was a lot of fun.
It was.
Yeah,
Thanks for
yeah,
the
yeah.
chat. It was great to chat. Great to see you, William.
You too.